So my plan was to just introduce myself as the flailing person in the back there. So we've established that that's me. Make sure, if you are wandering back there, you give a good radius. And if you've ever wondered, like, what on earth is happening back there, I really don't know what I'm doing. I feel like worship is my primary, or dance is my primary worship language. And so I just try to let the spirit and the words that we're singing move through me. So just stay clear. When I was asked to contribute a talk for this summer series, I haven't done a lot of these, but I kind of approached it the same way I've done it in the past, just by looking at what God is teaching me. And when I began looking back at what he's been teaching me, it really encompasses like the last 5 years. It's been quite a journey. And so if I had to summarize it in like one phrase, it'd be reassessing the rules that I've lived by, rules that have been given to me, rules that I've made up on my own, the rules that I sort of lived by. I listened to a podcast called Faith Adjacent, formerly The Bible Binge. It's recently been renamed, and one of the quotes that they had relatively recently was, be suspicious of your certainty. And I really related to that because I have always been so certain about many things, and I feel like my journey in the last 5 years has me not just not as certain, but a little suspicious when I am really certain about something. The older I get, I feel like the less I know. I'm a financial planner by profession, and my world is incredibly complex. It never gets simpler. Every year, the degree of complexity in the world of finance is a little astounding. I spend countless hours a year learning, and yet I feel sometimes like I know less now than when I graduated with my finance degree 15 years ago. And intellectually, I know there's so much more in this brain than there was 15 years ago. But maybe it's not that I know less. It might be that I have an awareness of how little I actually know. In my younger years, my world was only so big. And I felt like I had a solid understanding of the world. But what I didn't understand is I felt like I understood my world, not the world. There's so much more, but I was so sure about everything. I was sure about every opinion I had and every topic out there. I felt like I had some kind of answer. And my world was really black and white. I lived by a lot of rules. When my kids were little, I came across a phrase that said, I was such a better mother before I had kids. And I really related to that. Before I had kids, I was the worst. There's some kid misbehaving, and I could tell you, well, you just need to do this, this, and this, and that should take care of it. I had these rules. And when I was a parent of young spawn, there was, what worked on this tiny human did not work on this tiny human, and this world became a lot grayer. Suddenly there was just all this nuance that I just wasn't aware of before. Perhaps this is a little bit of a disclaimer, because let's be real, in the financial industry, we love a good disclaimer. But my disclaimer is that I can promise you that I don't have all the answers. Because the more I learn, the more I understand that the life that God created can't be boiled down to my simple set of rules. His creation is so vast, and me pretending to understand it, categorize it, or have all the answers is not super useful. And since we're in the middle of a disclaimer, my compliance department would probably like me to tell you that while I'm licensed to sell insurance in Alberta, investments in Alberta and BC, information given in this talk should not be necessarily taken for your own individual situation. Please seek professional advice for your individual situation, and by professionals for the sake of this talk. That would include Frank, Heidi, Barb, Dwayne, Jason. Seek the professionals. As humans, we like rules. And I know we like rules not just because we have laws and dress codes and social norms and expectations, but because I also like rules. I like rules because rules are shortcuts. Shortcuts save us energy. We don't have to process every little thing from the start. If we have rules about things, we can follow a flow chart. And we don't necessarily have to take each situation individually for what it is. Rules just kind of simplify our life. But as I walk through life, and especially these last 5 years, I'm finding that some of the rules I've applied to myself and some of the rules that I've applied to others are no longer helpful, and in some cases, harmful. I feel like the biggest theme God is teaching me right now is that rules sometimes allow us to bypass being in relationship with others. Does this mean that all the rules are bad? No, we still need rules to live by. But does it mean that we should never reassess the rules that we live by, especially if they're being challenged? It might help for me to give some examples. So as a kid, I grew up in a Christian denomination that during my parents' era was very, very about rules. There was like a whole written and unwritten rule book. And while that denomination had already begun to transition into something they called I'm trying to remember the word now. Basically, they were saying, we're moving away from the rule book, and you talk to God, and you find out what you're supposed to do in each situation. Well, the church had made that way. My parents just did what they knew. They knew rules, and so they gave us rules. And one of the rules was that you should not go to a movie theater. And I'm not entirely sure why, but apparently bad things happened there. So you weren't to go to a movie theater. So when I was in grade 10, I was in Edmonton, we were with the family, we were visiting some people, and we asked if we could go see a movie. Now, I say we, these were the people we were staying with. And my parents took a moment, and they decided to reassess the rules that they had, and they decided, you know what, maybe it's not such a bad thing. And so that was in the beginning of my grade 10 year, and in grade 10, I found my friends that I settled in with for the next 3 years, and 4 to 5 of them worked at movie theaters. So I spent much of the next 3 years in movie theaters, in relationship with people, because my parents were willing to reassess a rule that they had. If we fast forward to less than a year ago, Aaliyah, my kids had gone to a Christian school, and that school goes up to grade 8. So when Aaliyah went into grade 9 last year, she said, Mom, I'd like to go to the school dance. And I panicked. I've never been to school dance because I had a big list of rules. I'd never been. Jake never had the opportunity. And to give you a little bit of background, when our girls were little, we were kind of talking about what our biggest fears were for our kids. And my biggest fear was a life of drugs and addiction. And when I expressed this to Jake, he said, yeah, sure. But my biggest fear is boys, because with boys can come drugs and other problems. So even though I've never been to a school dance, I don't know what happens there. We panicked and just said no. I really like listening to a pastor from the States. His name is Craig Groeschel, and I listen to him because he also has a hobby-type interest in leadership, business leadership. So he puts out this business leadership podcast once or twice a month. And about a year or two ago, he said something that just will not leave my brain. He said that sometimes the things that we get most defensive about is probably the thing that we have the most to learn about. And instead of learning about why I was having this fear that Aaliyah would go to a school dance, we just panicked and said no. And the reality is she wasn't being in a relationship. She wasn't showing light to the world. She wasn't able to love anybody sitting at home because that's the rule we had given her. She would have the opportunity to love on people if she was not stuck to a rule. So I think this is good news for her because it sounds like maybe next time I chaperone at the dance. I should probably not show them how to dance. Someone will be injured. But we also have some really good examples in the Bible about reassessing rules. Connor, if you could bring up that first first one that I have up there. Perfect. So this is Acts 10. And what's happening in Acts 10, I'm not going to read the first 9 verses, but essentially an angel of the Lord appears to this Roman military officer named Cornelius. And this angel of the Lord says, I need you to send these guys over to this dude named Peter in Joppa. And so he sends them out, and starting in verse 9, the next day around noon, as Cornelius' men were approaching Joppa, Peter went up to the flat roof of the house to pray. He was hungry and wanted to eat. But while lunch was being prepared, he fell into a trance and entered into another realm. As the heavenly realm opened up, he saw something resembling a large linen tablecloth that descended from above, being let down to the earth by its 4 corners. As it floated down, he saw that it held many kinds of 4-footed animals, reptiles, and wild birds. A voice said to him, Peter, go and prepare them to be eaten. And Peter replied, there's no way I could do that, Lord. I have never eaten anything forbidden or impure according to our Jewish laws. The voice spoke again, nothing is unclean if God declares it to be clean. The vision was repeated 3 times, and suddenly the linen sheet was snatched back up into heaven. It's funny, I find it kind of ironic that they had, the voice had to repeat it 3 times, because I feel like sometimes God's like, Lacey, again, again, again. I have to sometimes hear it over and over again when I feel like I'm stuck in a rule. God was instructing these non-Jewish people to go meet with Peter and for them to have a relationship over a meal. And Peter said, no, but there's a rule about that. And God said, no. For this sake, you can eat whatever is there. The relationship is more important than whatever your rule is. The next passage, I obviously can't talk about reassessing rules without bringing up Pharisees. So I decided to just pick one passage where there's 2 examples. The next passage is from Matthew 12, and this one will start at the beginning. One Saturday on the day of rest, Jesus and his disciples were walking through a field of wheat. The disciples were hungry, so they plucked off some heads of grain and rubbed them in their hands to eat. But when some of the Pharisees saw what was happening, they said to him, look, your disciples shouldn't be harvesting grain on the Sabbath. Jesus responded, haven't you ever read what King David and his men did when they were hungry? They entered the house of God and ate sacred bread of God's presence, violating the law by eating bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. And haven't you read in the Torah that the priests violated the rules of the Sabbath by carrying out their duties in the temple on a Saturday, and yet they are without blame? But I say to you, there is one here who is even greater than the temple. If only you could learn the meaning of the words, I want compassion more than a sacrifice. You wouldn't be condemning my innocent disciples. For the Son of Man exercises his lordship over the Sabbath. Then Jesus left them and went into the synagogue, where he encountered a man who had an atrophied, paralyzed hand. The fault-finding Pharisees asked Jesus, is it permissible to perform a work of healing on the Sabbath? They only asked him this question because they hoped to accuse him of breaking the Jewish laws. He answered them, if any of you had a lamb that fell in a ditch on the Sabbath, wouldn't you reach out your hand and lift it out? Isn't a man much more valuable than a lamb? So of course, it's always proper to do miracles, even on the Sabbath. Then he turned to the man and said, hold out your hand, and as he stretched it out, it was restored, exactly like the other. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started to scheme about how they would destroy him. The Pharisees saw a rule and someone that didn't abide by those rules. So they immediately judged Jesus because he wasn't abiding by their set of rules. Jesus' response was that maybe there's some exceptions to the rules. And even greater than that, he wanted them to understand the words, I want compassion more than I want to sacrifice. So then the paralyzed man comes, and the Pharisees are quick to point out the rule and see if Jesus will break it. But Jesus chooses compassion and love over the rule. So if Jesus' command to us is to choose compassion, to love above all else, what rules have I put in place that shortcut love and compassion? And here's the rub. For many years, I was taught and I felt like reassessing the rules that I'd been handed, and I dutifully followed like a really good Pharisee. Reassessing those rules was equated with unbelief. They were one and the same. Unbelief was really bad, something to avoid like the plague, because unbelief was a pathway to losing your faith. Last year, I read a book on grief, and one of the things that just really stuck with me is that one of the reasons that grief is so hard, especially in our culture, is because you can often feel what we perceive to be conflicting emotions at the same time. So when you're grieving, you might experience joy from a memory of somebody that no longer walks this earth, while simultaneously feeling this intense sadness that they're no longer here walking with us on this earth. It's a little bit of a foreign concept to us that you can experience these two things at the same time. In my younger years, when I felt like I knew so much more, faith and unbelief felt conflicting to me, that they shouldn't coexist, and they can't exist together at the same time. I listened to a really great sermon by a pastor named Albert Tate back in June. His sermon was on faith and unbelief, and he talked about how they can coexist at the same time. God is okay with the two coexisting. It's okay if you have a faith and an unbelief at the same time. But the key to that is that he wants me to wrestle through the dissonance of their coexistence with him. Reassessing the rules I've lived by while holding on to my faith has really been the story of my journey for the last couple of years. Pastor Albert Tate talked about how God is less interested in the answers to our prayers than working through and wrestling through them with him. We often search for rules. We search for black and white answers. Our prayers go something like, God, please tell me this or this. Give me the flowchart version. Or, God, please just fill in the blank. Or, God, please just give me a rule so it's just easier and simpler. And I found in my own experience that these types of prayers even open a space for me to bypass being in a relationship with God. Because if I have rules now, I don't have to consult him with how I should be in relationship with this person. If I just have a rule, I can just bypass that relationship. Albert's talk was so good that I want to just throw up a 3-minute video clip. So we'll watch this video and then I'll wrap it up.
It's kind of like this. When I was in school, I was terrible at math. Matter of fact, I went to Bible college. I took the book of Numbers as a class, and that was my math requirement. That was it. I was done. That's the last time I see numbers in school. Give me some Habakkuk, please. You know what I mean? But I still remember struggling with math and being a kid working on my homework, and my math book just fell open to the back of the book. And I noticed in the back of the book, the answers are in the back of the book, and nobody told me the answers were in the back of the book this whole time. So I'm working on problem number 2. The answer to number 2 is right there. So my homework game went through the roof. You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry, game, in a way to influence or entice the listener into hearing me. My game went through the roof. So I just started turning my homework and just killing it. I'm just killing it. And my teacher, about 2 weeks in, I don't know, Miss Oliver called. She says, Albert, can I see you after class? And I said, yes, ma'am, you can, because that's what A students do. They hang out with the teacher after class. I'll see y'all later. Me and Miss Oliver got a meeting after class. So we're talking. She says, Albert, I noticed your homework grades have really grown up. I said, I'm glad you noticed. They have. She said, well, you're doing a good job. I said, well, Miss Oliver, really? You're a great teacher. Your influence on me has been so significant. You're doing a good job. I'm looking forward to teacher appreciation to appreciate you. You have influenced me. And then she says, yeah, but I had a question. I said, okay. She says, I noticed that you've been putting the right answers, but I haven't seen you show any of your work. And I said, huh? She says, yeah, Albert, I know you think it's a big deal to have the right answers, and that's important, but it may surprise you to know that I am actually much more interested in your work, your process, how did you get to the right answer? Because having the right answer is one thing, but me seeing your work lets me know that you are comprehending and understanding how the mathematical problem works. I'm looking for your analysis. I'm looking for your work. I'm looking for your journey to the answer, and that's more valuable to me than the actual answer. If y'all get it early, I won't have to preach as long. God is saying, I'm way less interested in your answer, and I'm much more interested in our journey together, our process together, what we discover, because that shows your comprehension of my grace and my love. Because I'm not interested in filling the blank in your journal. I'm interested in filling the hole in your life. And I want to walk with you. I want to walk with you.
I think I'll be watching and reading a little bit more of his stuff in the future. I'm really tempted to end this talk with my favorite Bible binge, now faith-adjacent phrase. In conclusion, nobody knows. But I will attempt to end with something more productive, which is simply encouraging you to wrestle with God this week about a potential area in your life where you've bypassed a relationship in favor of a rule. And I don't have a takeout menu type thing, but if you need a starting place, because I know that's a really broad question, how do I just, think about that? Sometimes for myself, it's helped to ask myself, is there someone or even an entire people group that annoy you? Do you have a rule that makes it really neat and tidy to keep them away? Because perhaps the person, place, or thing we are most offensive about are the people, places, or things that God has the most to teach us about. Thank you.